Hi, my name is David Hicks. Welcome to the series on getting to know Jesus. This is a continuation of part 10 on why Jesus was hated. In our last video, we looked at many of the villains of Jesus' day. And before I really get into this, I'm kind of convicted to say this one more time. I tried to say something like this in the last video, and I really want to hit home on this. Most people struggle to believe in Jesus. Many people, let me say that way. I don't know enough to say most. But many people do not believe in Jesus because of hypocrisy. Their lives or the lives of someone they loved have been hurt by people who said they were religious, acted as if they were religious, believed in God, maybe, claimed to believe in Jesus, claimed to follow Jesus, but they were doing dark, evil deeds on the side, or maybe in front of everybody. Their life just did not reflect it. I heard this story the other day, and I've heard similar stories about a waitress being asked, would she rather serve just somebody who walks in on a Friday night or serve the after-church crowd on Sunday? And her answer was basically unequivocally that the walk-in crowd on Friday night, because the church crowd on Sunday were typically, rude, didn't tip well, those kinds of things. So that's just a small example of how hypocrisy can hurt you. It might have hurt you or someone you love, someone you know. And there are much worse examples than that. And so the reason I wanted to go over why Jesus was hated is because I want you to see that Jesus himself had to constantly deal with hypocrisy. But that didn't stop him from loving and following God. It frustrated him like nothing else. He hated it like nothing else. You don't see Jesus getting angry anywhere except when he was dealing with hypocrites. And so my prayer, my pleading to you is that don't let hypocrites, don't let people who said they were following God and Jesus and they weren't, stop you from learning about God, learning about Jesus, and following them. As Jesus himself refused to let that stop him, my prayer for you is that you will refuse to let such people stop you from following, knowing, and loving Christ. So that's really the main reason I wanted to go over this. And I think the one story that will illustrate this for you is the one we're going to start with today. It's John chapter 8, verse 1 through 11, a woman caught in adultery. Now, we're probably not going to get all these verses, I don't know, but Matthew 15, just so you can see what is here. Matthew 15, Jesus breaks tradition, those tradition laws the Pharisees had, and he gets, confronted for it. Matthew 22, verse 15 to 33, people are coming up, they're trying to trick Jesus, so we will see that today in our very first story. And in Matthew 23, Jesus just blasts the scribes and Pharisees. Now, we'll probably skip some of this, but John 8, 1 through 11. Now, before we read John 8, 1 through 11, I need to read a verse from the Old Testament, the writings from God that were in place in Jesus' day. And this is Leviticus chapter 20, beginning at verse 10. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. God hates adultery. And in the Old Testament law, the punishment for adultery was literally death. Now, keep that in mind. And I know you're thinking, whoa, that's extreme. Keep that in mind as we read John 8, and we'll deal with that in a moment. John 8, verse 1. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Excuse me. Itchy throat. Still trying to get over a cold here. So the teachers of the law and the Pharisees bring to Jesus a woman caught in adultery. They talk about, hey, the law of Moses says we should stone such women. By the way, it included the guy too. Don't know if you failed to notice that or not. We just read it. It's supposed to be both, but they just single out the woman, blame the woman, and bring her to Jesus. Now, they're not seeking justice here. They're not seeking righteousness. They're not seeking obedience to God. They're seeking a way to accuse Jesus. So how might that work out? Well, Jesus says, yes, stone her. Well, they were under Roman rule. You couldn't enforce, I guess, capital punishment on somebody when you're just a Jew. That had to be carried out, and that had to be decided by the Romans whether someone was worthy to be put to death or not. And so if Jesus tried to do that, then they could accuse him to the Romans. If Jesus says, no, don't, that's just ignore that command. Then they're going to tell the whole Jewish community that Jesus has no respect for the law of Moses. And so they're going to try and turn people away from Jesus that way. So let's see how Jesus handled this situation. Beginning, this is still in verse 6. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with a woman standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Other translations say, "Go and sin no more." Now, here it is, this woman, she's humiliated, obviously, and Jesus starts to write down, he just ignores the Pharisee and teachers of the law, just stooped down, he's just doodling on the ground, writing something, who knows, there's been a lot of speculation about what he was writing. That's not important. The important part is he's really drawing attention away from the woman, taking the eyes off of her so that she's not so embarrassed and not so humiliated. And now the focus is not on the woman, it's focused on Jesus. What in the world are you doing? Hey, we asked you a question. Aren't you going to answer us? So they keep hounding him. And finally he looks up and says, okay, the first one of you without sin, throw the stone. Let the first person throw the stone be the one without sin. And I love the way this happens because beginning with the oldest, then to the youngest, they start to walk away. Because the oldest one has been around long enough to know, yeah, I'm not sinless. But the younger ones, they're a little more arrogant. Like, I've been following God all my life. I've been dedicated. I've been keeping all the commandments. And then finally they're like, well, where did everybody go? And they leave as well. So Jesus then talks to the woman. He said, well, where are they? I think they're gone. Is no one here to, I want to go back and read it the way it's written here. Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. So what's the whole deal then about adultery being a capital punishment offense? You see, the goal, of this law in the Old Testament and the other laws similar to it about, hey, if you do this, the punishment is being stoned. The goal wasn't death. The goal was to teach. The goal was to help people understand that this sin, adultery, is so grievous that it brings death. Spiritual death, first and foremost, but it can lead to death in physical ways as well. but it's something that God does hate. It's something to avoid. It's something to keep out of your life. But the goal was never to let's try and kill as many people as we possibly can. That was never the message of the prophets. The message of the prophets was to repent and turn to God, not repent and then all those of you who've committed some sort of capital offense line up and we're going to kill you. No, the goal was to teach and to help people understand adultery is one of those sins that brings death. And so Jesus tells her, neither do I condemn you. This was not the time of condemnation. Go back to kind of the verse that centered is the heart and soul of this entire series, John 3:16, but I'm going to include verse 17 as well. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, his only one begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. See, this was not the time of condemnation. Now is not the time of condemnation. That's on Judgment Day. Okay? Now is the time to be saved. Now is the time to get your life right with God, to get your life right with Jesus. And again, God's goal is not to put to death anyone and everyone who's committed sins worthy of death. God's goal is for us to go our way and sin no more, to leave our lives of sin. We're not going to be perfect. God's grace is there to cover our imperfections, okay? So Jesus, he didn't condone what the woman had done, but he just encouraged her by saying, I don't condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. Go and sin no more. That is love, and it's just Jesus to a T as far as who he was and how he dealt with people. All right, let's look at Matthew 15. I'll probably skip Matthew 22. We'll see. I don't know. How are we doing on time? Matthew 15. I really want to get to Matthew 23. Well, hey, if that's the one I want to get to, let's just do that. All right, Matthew chapter 23. Because it's long, and B, I want you to see how Jesus felt about the villains here and what they were doing. I really want you to see Jesus in a way that most people have never even knew he was at times. All right, so Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels of their prayer shawls long. Okay, should have looked this up ahead of time, but phylacteries, if I remember correctly, were like little, I have to go back and look this up, but I think there were little boxes that had scriptures in them that you would wear. And anyway, it was definitely a religious symbol. And so they made these wide so that people would see them in order to notice, oh wow, look how religious they are. Because everything they were doing was to be seen by men. And what did Jesus mean? They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. One of the things I think Jesus is alluding to here is, these tradition laws, all these things they bound society by and made life extremely difficult for people, and they weren't willing to help people out. I think that's one of the things that he was alluding to. But let's keep going. Verse 6, they love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. All right, so, sorry, nose. It's itching. Here, this is, when we went over a series on Jesus' teachings, I was thinking, man, I should have gone over that verse, because it comes up in more than one place. It's verse 11, it's verse 12. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. If you study pride and humility in the Bible, it is a consistent theme all the way through. It soaks the scriptures with this teaching that God loves the humble. God lifts up the humble. He listens to the humble. But if those who approach him in pride, those who are arrogant, he brings down. And you cannot approach God in a spirit of pride and arrogance and be pleasing to him. So here Jesus, he talks about how these Pharisees, they love being called rabbi, they love being called teacher, and other things like that. And Jesus is saying, look, you don't deserve that. If I were to put it in my own words, I would say it's almost like he's saying, these titles, you don't go by these titles. You've got one master, it's God. You've got one teacher, it's God. You've got one Father, it's God. Well, actually, he says we have one teacher, the Christ. So don't be so arrogant as to take on these special titles. That seems to be the gist of what Jesus is saying. Verse 13, woe to you. Now, that expression, woe to you, is the opposite of it's basically putting a curse on somebody. It's the opposite of blessing someone. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Extremely strong language. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. So here Jesus is blasting them because they had these get-arounds, shall we say. When people made vows to the Lord, well, if you did it this way, if you said this, it's really nothing. You can, get away with not obeying it, not doing what you said you were going to do. But now if you said this, then you really are obligated to do it. And Jesus just blasts them for this kind of hypocrisy. Verse 23, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides! You strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. All right, I'm going to stop on this one because this really highlights the heart of the problem. And by the way, I don't know how to pronounce this spice, C-U-M-M-I-N. Please forgive me if I mispronounced it. But Jesus said, you hypocrites, you give a tenth of your spices. They tithed, gave a tenth of what they had to God. But so you will give a tenth of your spices, but you neglect justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You do these little things, but the huge things you don't do. And so he was just hacked off at this and just going off on them because of this. And that's what happens so often with us. We'll, we'll do the tiny religious things that don't really demand a change of heart or a change of life. But when it comes to loving people, trusting God, obeying Him, treating others the way we want to be treated, those we ignore. Mankind's been like that throughout its history. And so that's why we got to take a hard look at ourselves and saying, okay, am I just doing religious things, or am I really dedicated to God here? Am I really trying to do the things that matter to Him? He said, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Think of it this way: it's like having a little fly in your soup. You'll strain that out, but if there was a giant, say you had a giant bowl of soup and there was a camel in it, you would you'd swallow it. You would not even notice it was there. So it's kind of a humorous, to me, it's pretty humorous listening to it about how they'd be willing to strain out a gnat, but they'd swallow a camel. But it is very serious because Jesus is very angry here. Verse 25, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Now, Jesus' main concern isn't dishes, okay, and making sure we use good hygiene with our dishes. He's talking about who we are as human beings. We can make ourselves look all sorts of pretty and beautiful and handsome on the outside, but on the inside, we can be full with some serious ugliness, the ugliness of evil. And so what we really need to do is clean our inside, our hearts, our minds, and then we can worry about the outside. And no, I'm not saying don't take a bath again until you've decided to follow God. No, that's not what I mean. But you get the point. It's so much more important that we worry about our inside being clean, and our outside is secondary. They had it backwards. Verse 27, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the sin of your forefathers. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house has left you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. All right, so without getting into too many of those details, the main thing to see in all this is Jesus abhorred hypocrisy. He dealt with it all throughout his ministry days. They were the ones who were constantly objecting to him, constantly hounding him, and hounding others and hurting others spiritually. And so he just completely goes off on them. It's not a surprise then that, maybe a few of these listened to Jesus' words and were convicted of their sin and repented, but for the most part, they did not. And it's not surprising that the ones that Jesus went off on in Matthew 23 are the ones who orchestrated his death. This death that we will start looking at in our next video. Thank you for listening. Again, the two that we did not discuss, if you want to read more about this, Matthew 15, 1 through 20, Jesus breaks tradition, and the Pharisees confront him on that. Matthew 22, 15 through 33, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they're all come up. They try and trick Jesus. They're trying to trap him and ask him all sorts of questions that they deem hard. And Jesus just kind of smacks them and swats them right and left, like with his answers. So anyway, thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe. Have a great, wonderful, fantastic day. God bless.